Some places were built for joy, bright lights, salty wind, the sound of cheap prizes clacking in tin booths. But even at Coney Island, cruelty still looks for a stage. It started with a shove. The Crutches skidded on wet boards, a combat boot followed, and a man with a faded service patch curled around the pane, while the crowd pretended the Ferris wheel was more interesting. "Go away, trash," one thug laughed, lifting his foot for another kick, because bullies love audiences and nights with no consequences. Only this night had one. A shadow stepped out of the rain, eyes steady, jaw set. Jasonstatham didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, he just moved closer, close enough that the ocean hush felt louder than the thug's nerves. No one on the boardwalk knew how it would end. They only knew one thing. The men who chose the wrong target were about to learn what respect looks like when it finally shows up. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Your support truly keeps these stories alive. If you're enjoying what we do, the stories that touch the heart and remind us there's still good in this world, consider subscribing and joining our little family here. It means more than you know. Rain fell hard that night at Coney Island. The kind of rain that feels heavy, like the sky itself is tired. Neon lights flickered over empty stalls, and the air smelled like salt, fried dough, and cold pavement. Most people had gone home, except a few drunk tourists, a couple of vendors closing late, and one man in a wheelchair sitting quietly under a broken street lamp. His name was Frank, a former Marine, a man who'd seen more than most could bear, and survived what others didn't. He didn't beg, he didn't bother anyone. He just sat there, his jacket zipped tight, his medals tucked away in a pocket no one would notice, a small paper cup resting near his wheel. Every so often someone would toss in a coin, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of respect. But mostly, they just walked by. To the crowd, he was invisible, another story no one had time to hear. Frank wasn't bitter, though. He'd stopped expecting kindness from strangers years ago. Life had taken enough from him already, his leg, his career, his family, and the laughter that used to live in his chest. Now he just wanted peace. Maybe a quiet meal, a warm place to rest. That's all. But peace that night was not what he was going to get. Two men stumbled out of a nearby arcade, loud, drunk, and laughing at nothing. One wore a black beanie, the other a leather jacket that looked 2 sizes too tight. They moved like they owned the boardwalk, shouting at each other, throwing half-eaten food toward the trash. "Hey," the one in leather said, nodding toward Frank. "Look at this guy, what's he doing out here? You lose your ride, old man." Frank didn't answer. He'd learned silence was safer. The man in the beanie grinned. "Maybe he's just looking for attention. You want attention, huh, soldier boy?" He kicked Frank's cup, spilling coins across the wet boards. The sound of metal hitting wood was sharp, cutting through the noise of the rain. Frank leaned forward, trying to gather them quietly, but the man stepped on his hand. "Oops," he said mockingly, "my bad." Frank winced but didn't look up. That was the moment that broke something in the man. Bullies hate being ignored. "You think you're too good to talk, huh?" the man said, his voice rising. "You think because you wore some uniform that you're better than us." He shoved Frank's chair backward. It rolled a few inches before hitting the curb. "Go away, trash," he sneered. The other man laughed. Maybe he needs help leaving. The next kick hit the wheel, snapping the rubber edge. Frank's chair jerked to one side. He tried to hold his balance, but when the next shove came, it was too much. The chair tipped over, crashing against the pavement. Frank hit hard, his elbows scraping the ground. Still, he said nothing. He just looked up, eyes filled not with fear, but with that quiet sadness that only men who have seen too much can carry. The crowd around them froze. No one moved, no one spoke. Some even turned away. Because that's what people do when the world gets ugly. They pretend it's not their problem. And then, from the edge of the boardwalk, someone else stopped walking. A man in a dark coat, hood pulled low, his steps steady. Jasonstatham. He'd been heading home from a quiet dinner, phone still in his pocket, coffee in his hand. But when he saw the wheelchair lying on the ground, he stopped. He watched for a moment, long enough to see the kick, the shove, the cruelty. And something in him changed. Jason wasn't a man who went looking for fights anymore. Those days were behind him. But there's a certain kind of silence, a moral silence, that he couldn't stand. That deep, ugly stillness when good people watch something bad happen and decide to do nothing. He took one last sip of coffee, tossed the cup aside, and started walking toward them. "Hey." His voice was calm, low, but it cut through the noise like a knife. The men turned. "What's it to you, mate?" the one in the leather jacket asked. Jason didn't answer right away. He knelt beside Frank, gently lifting the wheelchair upright, checking the man's arm. "You all right, sir?" Frank nodded faintly, his breathing rough. Jason looked up, his jaw tightened. "Apologize." The thug laughed. "What to him?" His friend chimed in. "You don't know who you're talking to." Jason stood slowly. The rain caught the edge of his coat, dripping from his sleeve. "That's the funny thing," he said. "Neither do you. There's a certain kind of tension that fills the air before a storm breaks. That's what this was." The two thugs took a step closer, puffing their chests. "Listen, man, this isn't your business." Jason's eyes never left theirs. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it is now." The man swung first. "Big mistake." Jason sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, twisted. The thug's body spun midair before crashing into the puddled pavement. The second one lunged, yelling, but Jason blocked him, elbowed him in the chest, and sent him stumbling back into the wall. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Rain kept falling, washing streaks of mud across the ground. The crowd that had once been silent began to murmur. Jason turned, helping Frank back into his chair. "You all right?" Frank nodded again, tears mixing with rain. "I didn't mean I wasn't bothering them." "I know," Jason said softly. "They just forgot what respect looks like." By now the thugs were limping away, muttering curses under their breath. One of them turned and spat. "You'll regret that." Jason didn't even look back. "No," he said quietly, "you will." The old man tried to thank him, but Jason shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You've done enough for people like them and me." Frank frowned. "Do I know you?" Jason smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter, you just know you're not alone tonight." The lights of the Ferris wheel spun slowly behind them, red, blue, and white reflecting on the puddled street. The rain began to slow, turning to a drizzle. Jason pushed the wheelchair under a canopy near a small cafe that was still open. "Let's get you something warm," he said. Frank hesitated. "You don't have to." Jason looked at him, the kind of look that ends all arguments. "I know." They went inside. The waitress blinked when she saw them. A veteran, drenched and bruised, and a man who looked like he'd just walked out of a storm. "Coffee?" she asked softly. Jason nodded, "Too, and something hot to eat." Frank tried to protest again. "I can't pay for." Jason cut him off gently. "You've already paid enough, mate." For the first time that night, Frank smiled. Not much, but enough to show there was still light somewhere behind the years of pain. Outside, the neon lights reflected in the puddles like tiny fireworks. Inside, two men sat quietly, one rebuilding faith, the other silently carrying his own kind of burden. And for a brief moment, the noise of the world faded away. Because sometimes, kindness doesn't roar. It just shows up quietly when nobody else does. The diner's old ceiling fan hummed softly above them. Rain still trickled down the windows, turning the neon lights outside into blurry streaks of red and blue. The air smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, ordinary scents that somehow made the moment feel more human. Frank sat in his wheelchair by the corner booth, hands cupped around a steaming mug of coffee. Jason sat across from him, silent for a while. Sometimes you don't need words. Sometimes silence does the talking, and right now, that silence was heavy with everything Frank had been through. The waitress, a young woman named Marie, slid over a plate of eggs and toast. She looked nervous, still shaken from what she'd seen earlier outside. He's really okay?" she asked softly. Jason nodded. "He will be." Frank gave a small smile, though his hands trembled. "Haven't had a hot meal in days," he murmured. "Didn't think tonight would end this way." Jason leaned forward. "Nobody should have to think that way, Frank." The veteran's eyes flicked up cautious. "You know my name." Jason smiled faintly. "It's stitched on your jacket." Frank chuckled for the first time, weak but real. Guess I still wear my past on my sleeve, huh? Jason's voice softened. There's no shame in that, you earned it. Outside, thunder rolled over the boardwalk. The two thugs from earlier hadn't gone far. They lingered under the Ferris wheel, soaked, angry, muttering curses into the rain. You believe that guy, one hissed, rubbing his jaw. Who does he think he is? His friend spat onto the ground. Some wannabe hero. We'll find him again, make him wish he'd stayed out of it. They didn't notice the shadow that had followed them out of the diner. Jason had seen the look in their eyes before, men who weren't done causing pain. And men like that didn't stop until someone made them. He waited, watching. Rain dripped off the brim of his coat. He didn't chase revenge. He wasn't built that way anymore. But if those men went after someone else, another Frank, then walking away would make him no better than the people who turned their heads earlier that night. Back inside, Frank ate slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate, the kind of careful that comes from living with constant pain. You ever wonder, Frank said suddenly, why people stop caring, why they look right at you but see nothing? Jason leaned back, arms crossed. Every day. Frank nodded. Used to think maybe I scared them. The uniform, the chair, the way I talk. But now, I think they just don't want to feel guilty. Easier to look away. Jason said nothing for a while. Then quietly he replied, that's why we can't. Frank looked up. We. Jason smiled. You think I just helped you tonight? Nah, you helped me too. Reminded me why some fights are still worth getting into. Frank chuckled again, though it came out more like a cough. You sound like my old captain. He used to say that some fights don't end, son. They just wait. Jason nodded slowly. Then maybe tonight one of them ended. When Frank finally finished his meal, Jason helped him back outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and quiet. The Ferris wheel lights flickered in the distance, like a heartbeat. Got anywhere to stay? Jason asked. Frank hesitated. Shelter down on 5th, but they close early. I'll probably just stay near the boardwalk. Jason frowned. You sure? Frank shrugged. Been worse. Jason reached into his coat, pulled out his wallet, and laid a few folded bills in Frank's lap. Frank's eyes widened. Hey, no, I can't take that. You're not taking it, Jason said. You earned it. Frank looked at him for a long moment, tears gathering again. You got kids? Jason shook his head. No, but I've seen enough to know what a father's supposed to be. Frank smiled sadly. Then you'd have been a good one. As Jason turned to leave, something caught his eye, the two thugs again. They circled back, walking toward a small group of teenagers near the boardwalk games. One of them shoved a kid aside, grabbing a wallet out of his hand. Jason's jaw set. Stay here, he said softly to Frank. He walked forward, slow, measured, but with that unmistakable tension in his stride, like a fuse burning toward something inevitable. Didn't you boys learn anything tonight? Jason said, voice cutting through the air. They froze, one turned, his smirk faltering. You again. Jason stopped just a few feet away. Yeah, me again. The other thug spat on the ground. You think you're some kind of savior, huh? Jason tilted his head slightly. No, I just think I'm done letting people like you keep winning. Before they could react, Jason stepped forward. The first swing came sloppy, fueled by anger, not skill. Jason caught it, twisted the arm behind the man's back and swept his leg. The guy hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The second thug lunged, grabbing a metal pipe from the trash nearby. He swung wildly. Jason ducked, slammed his elbow into the man's ribs, then drove his knee forward. The pipe clattered to the ground. Jason didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, breathing, staring down at them. Now you listen, he said quietly. You ever touch another person the way you touched him? He pointed toward Frank, who was watching from the distance. And I'll make sure you never walk another boardwalk again. The men didn't answer. They just scrambled up and ran, disappearing into the rain-slick alleys behind the arcade. Jason turned back toward Frank, who was gripping the armrest of his chair tightly. Wasn't expecting that, Frank said, voice trembling somewhere between shock and awe. Jason half smiled. Neither were they. Frank's eyes softened. You didn't have to do that for me. Jason crouched down beside him. I didn't. I did it for everyone they would have hurt next. Frank nodded slowly. You ever in the service? Jason looked away, something like that. The two men stood there for a while, one in a wheelchair, one standing beside him, both bruised by the world but still standing in their own ways. Later that night, Jason drove Frank to a small veterans outreach shelter on the east side of Brooklyn. The place wasn't much, a converted church with flickering lights and a coffee pot that never seemed to stop brewing, but it was safe. Frank looked up at the sign quietly. Haven't been inside one of these in years. Jason helped him out of the car, lifting the broken wheelchair down gently. Time you did. Frank paused. You sure you're not an angel or something? Jason chuckled. If I was, I'm the kind that's had his wings clipped a long time ago. Frank smiled. Still, thank you for tonight for seeing me. Jason looked at him for a moment. Don't thank me. Just promise me something next time someone else gets kicked down. Don't let them think they're alone either. Frank extended his hand, trembling but firm. You got it. Jason shook it, nodding once before turning to leave. As he walked back to his car, Jason caught his reflection in the glass door, a man older, wearier but with a purpose again. He hadn't felt that in years. Sometimes it's not about saving the world. Sometimes it's about saving one person and realizing that's enough. Meanwhile, back at the boardwalk, the storm had fully passed. Police lights flashed where the two thugs had been cornered by another witness who'd called it in. Jason hadn't even known about it. He wasn't looking for credit. He was already driving away, headlights cutting through the mist, the radio silent except for the sound of rain. As the city lights faded behind him, he thought about what Frank had said. You ever wonder why people stop caring? Jason whispered to himself, maybe they just need someone to remind them how. The next morning, the sun broke over Coney Island like it was trying to apologize for the night before. Marie, the waitress, unlocked the diner door early, setting out chairs and wiping tables. When she looked outside, she noticed something taped to the window, an envelope. On it in neat handwriting were the words, "For Frank." Inside was a note and a small stack of bills. The note read, "For a soldier who stood taller sitting down than most do on their feet, J." Marie smiled softly, tears brimming. She walked to the shelter that afternoon and handed it to Frank herself. He read it slowly, his lips trembling. He didn't even leave a number. Marie grinned. Maybe he figured heroes don't need one. Weeks passed. Frank started helping out at the same diner, cleaning tables, greeting customers, making coffee for tired regulars. He didn't want charity. He wanted purpose. And every time someone dropped a coin into his old paper cup that now sat by the register, he'd smile and say the same thing. Pass it forward. He never forgot the man in the black coat. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the boardwalk, Frank swore he could still hear that calm voice in his head. You're not trash, you're a soldier, don't forget it. The story spread quietly, locals talked about the night, a stranger stood up for a disabled vet. No one knew his name, just that he came out of nowhere like the storm itself and left just as quietly. But for Frank and everyone who heard the story, that night changed something. It reminded them that kindness can still fight back. That strength doesn't come from anger, but from compassion backed by courage. And that sometimes the world needs a man who doesn't walk away. Because cruelty never wins forever, not when decency still has fighters left. And on that rain-soaked Coney Island night, decency had a name. Jasonstatham.